All right, guys, welcome back to Unit 3, Outcome 2, Key Knowledge 7, Termination Management. Okay, so here is our snapshot of the study design, and here's where we're at. So you can see we're moving through the study design pretty quickly. Only a few more to go after this one. So first off, termination management. What do we actually mean by termination? Okay, termination, basically when the employment relationship ends. Okay, so in other words, the employee is no longer going to be working at our business. And I guess the point of this and where this ultimately ends up, given what the key knowledge dot point said, is that first off, you have to understand the reasons. There's 4 of them, which are identified in the study design, which we'll talk about. But it's also important as a business owner, business manager, that you understand that it's essential that the business treats the employee both fairly and lawfully when the employment relationship comes to an end. And how that plays out, you'll see when we get into the later parts of this video. Now, the point is that when the employment relationship comes to an end or employment is terminated, the impetus for that decision can come from either the employer or the employee, okay? And the method used for the termination can be either voluntary or involuntary, okay? So involuntary on the part of the employee. So look, those 4 reasons are identified in the study design. Okay, the ones that you see on the right there: resignation, retirement, retrenchment, and dismissal. Basically, when anybody ever leaves a business, they're leaving for one of those 4 reasons. There are no other reasons that people leave a business. It always can be categorized under one of those 4. So termination on the left, the top 2, resignation and retirement, are voluntary, and the bottom 2, retrenchment and dismissal, are involuntary. And coming back to this voluntary and involuntary, what we mean by voluntary is, in other words, it's the employee's decision. They're voluntarily leaving the business. And the involuntary, again, mean involuntary on the part of the employee. So in other words, it's the employer's decision that the employment relationship is coming to an end, or the employment is being terminated. So the 4 different types and 2 categories, each with 2 within them. Okay. Now, the business must manage the termination process. This is all about termination management, whichever of those 4 methods are being used, to basically ensure legal compliance, and secondly, to make sure that the business is acting ethically. So when we're talking about termination management, it's important from the business's point of view that those 2 things are considered. Okay, so going back to our study design descriptor here, the key knowledge dot point, it said termination management including retirement, redundancy, resignation, and dismissal. So that's the 4, and we'll talk about each of those 4 in turn, exactly what they mean, how they play out. But then the entitlement considerations that are mentioned in the study design dot point, that's all about ensuring legal compliance. And then the transition considerations, that is all about making sure the business is acting ethically. So when we get to that part of the video, that will kind of make more sense. So within this video, we're going to cover all of those. We'll talk through each of the different 4 types of termination, and then we'll talk about entitlement considerations and finally transition considerations. So we're sure that we're covering everything that you guys need to know on this particular topic. So first off, let's get into the first one, the voluntary method 1, resignation. Okay, so this is when the employee voluntarily decides to leave the business, generally to take up another position. It might be with a competitor, it might not, but basically leaving the business to find alternative employment. Now, the employee needs to give notice equal to 1 pay period at least. Okay, often you can give more, but as a minimum, the employee needs to give notice of their resignation of 1 pay period. That's called the period of notice. So if you're paid weekly, you need to give 1 week's notice. If you're paid fortnightly, as many people are, you need to give 2. If you're paid monthly, then you need to give a month's notice. Pretty simple. Now, there's other stuff in here, an exit interview. Look, This isn't in the study design, but I guess the next few minutes I'm just going to talk about stuff that could be included in an answer. Like, you wouldn't be asked specifically about an exit interview. It's not mentioned in the study design. But this is kind of more information that you could use in an answer. If there was some kind of an extended response where you're talking about voluntary resignation, then this is stuff that might be useful to include in an answer, and a process that a business might go through around resignation. The exit interviews, basically, when people resign, it's worth having an interview with that person to find out the reasons that they have resigned. And if you do this with every person that resigns from the business, it can uncover some issues that you might need to deal with. So, for example, if people are all mentioning a particular manager in the business, this is the reason resigning, because they've got issues with that manager, or that manager's doing the wrong thing. It can then direct you as a more senior manager or the business owner to maybe have a bit more of a look at that particular manager and what's going on there. And you want to end the resignations that are associated with that particular manager. It might be that you uncover through the exit interview that people feel they're not trained adequately. So that then gives you information. Okay, we need to look at the training we're offering and putting our staff through, because they're leaving the business because they're not feeling trained, can't do their jobs properly. So you see what I mean? The exit interview is, the point of that is to uncover any issues that you could then deal with to kind of stem the flow of future resignations. Okay. I've also put in here something on gardening leave. Again, this is not something you would be specifically asked about, but it could be useful to know about. So just make a quick note on it. Look, gardening leave is around this period of notice. Now, some businesses, when someone resigns, rather than getting them to work their period of notice, which is the usual way to do things, they might actually say, right, we don't want you to be here within the business, go home. They still have to pay you for your period of notice, but they don't actually want you within the business. And there's a bunch of reasons that might happen. For example, there might be confidentiality issues. So, for example, if you have access to a customer database, for example, and the employer feels that the employee who's resigning is going to go to a competitor, what they want to do is maybe minimize the risk of customer information being stolen that they could then take to that competitor. I mean, realistically, if the employee who's resigning is going to do that, they probably would have done that before they actually resigned, if they were smart, but it can minimize the risk. Another reason they might do it, look, if someone's resigned because they're not happy in the business, once they've resigned, they're probably going to really switch off and might actually be quite negative about the business. So what you don't want is someone coming to work every day for a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever that notice period is, and then kind of bagging out the business, bagging out the managers, whatever it might be, just creating a negative kind of vibe, a negative culture in the workplace. So one way to do that is to actually not have them at the workplace, and you put them on what we call gardening leave. Okay, so just a couple of extra bits in there which could be useful for an extended response. You won't be specifically asked about them, but kind of good to know in case. The second voluntary method is retirement. So this is basically when the employee leaves, but they're actually leaving the paid workforce completely. Okay, so they're not going to another job. They're definitely not going to a competitor. They're just stopping work. Now, obviously, you associate this with older employees. They reach retirement age, 65, 67, whatever it might be. Some people work much longer than that, but it can apply to anyone. I've know of a few people that retired in their 30s just because they'd earned enough money by that stage, to kind of look after themselves for the rest of their lives. They could afford to retire, so they did. But basically, the key here is they're leaving the paid workforce altogether for whatever reason that might be. Again, the employee needs to give a period of notice. And again, legally it's the same, the pay period. But realistically, you usually have much more notice of this, particularly if it's because of, their age, they're reaching retirement age. People kind of plan their retirement. So the notice period given is often much greater for a retiring employee, which is really useful to the business because they've got that much longer to plan for that loss within the business. So that's kind of helpful. Now, the impacts of voluntary resignation, whether it's resignation or retirement either, actually. So I guess the impacts of voluntary termination, this probably more accurately. Number one could be the loss of talent. So if you're losing a particularly good, valuable, productive employee, that's obviously not a good thing. In your sports team, it's like if your best player leaves, that's going to have a negative impact on the ability of the team to win. So in the business context, your ability to achieve your objectives might be impacted because you're losing one of your key players. There also is going to be a replacement cost involved. You need to hire a new person to replace the person who's leaving. So there's the recruitment costs, particularly if you're going to use a recruitment agency. But however you're going to replace that person, you're going to incur some costs in doing so. Decline in morale, potentially. Look, if this is a real key person in the team and an upbeat person that everyone likes, that can negatively impact morale for a while. I guess on the flip of that, if it's somebody that people don't particularly like, I guess morale could actually improve. So that kind of could work either way. Kind of associated to that breakdown of good teams. If this person's a real team player, particularly a leader within teams, then those teams can suffer. So these are kind of, linked together pretty closely, some of these things. And then productivity in or decrease. Again, if the person is a really valuable person in the business, you might see your productivity decrease for a period of time, until the replacement kind of gets back up to the speed that the person who's leaving is at. Or again, if the person was not particularly good and wasn't particularly productive, I guess overall you might actually see a productivity increase due to them leaving. So these things, kind of you need to think about the particular scenario. And if you were given a case around this, there'd probably be some information around which of these is going to apply in terms of are they positive or negative, I guess. But just so you kind of get a feel, generally speaking, when people voluntarily leave a business, these are the kinds of impacts that we can be looking at. All right, so moving on to involuntary. So the first type was redundancy. So first off, just to put out there that another term for redundancy is retrenchment. So you can make employees redundant or you can retrench them. Look, the study design refers to it as redundancy. So I'm assuming in your end of your exams, that's the terminology they would use, but just putting it out there just in case. And if you see news items in the media and stuff, they can use either term, but it means exactly the same thing. So look, this is termination by the employer, so hence involuntary, because it no longer needs a particular job to be done, or it needs fewer people to do that particular job. Okay, so this is, I guess the key here is putting out there this is not the fault of the employee. The employee hasn't done anything wrong. It's literally that the business just no longer has a use for that person. Okay, so just throwing in here some media snapshots recently, some lead stories from the press. Streaming jobs go at 10 in global restructure. Booktopia, at least 30 redundancies. So this is the sort of stuff when you're seeing in the media. So it kind of puts what we're learning here into the context of what's going on in the real world, I guess. And here I'm just, highlighting the language, making at least 4 others redundant as part of a global restructure. Booktopia CMO, one of at least 30 redundancies. Just so, if you didn't before, when you see these kinds of stories in the media, that you understand exactly what that means. So, like I said before, this isn't because these employees have done anything wrong. It's just literally that for whatever reason, we'll look at some reasons in a minute, the business no longer needs those particular people. So reasons why this might happen. So why might redundancies occur in a business? Because it's not an ideal situation, because at the end of the day, people are losing their jobs and nobody wants to see people losing their jobs. But sometimes it's kind of a necessary part of doing business. So here is some, not an exhaustive list, but it gives you some reasons why businesses might need to make these decisions to make some people redundant. First off, the business is underperforming. Okay, so in other words, it's not meeting its targets. It's not making as much profit as it was hoping to or as it was aiming to. Then if you're not making as much profit, if you're not bringing as much income in, you need to cut costs. And one of the ways to cut costs is through making people redundant, because obviously then you're reducing your wage bill. Now, I have to be a little bit careful with that one, because as I'm sure some of you are aware, and we'll talk about a little bit later, when you do make people redundant, the business has to usually, and we'll talk about when and how this works, provide a redundancy payment to that employee. And that actually can be quite a high amount of money. So when the business is making people redundant, in the long run, it's going to save you money because you're reducing your wage bill. But in the short run, actually can be quite an expensive exercise to go through, depending on who you're making redundant. And we'll get to that shortly. Another reason for redundancies, an employer is closing all or part of its business. Obviously, if the business is closing down completely, everyone's being made redundant, but it might be that they're closing down a particular location, for example, because that location, for whatever reason, isn't performing and they decide to get rid of that particular location. So obviously the people that work in that particular location might end up being made redundant. There are ways you could get around this by perhaps offering those people jobs in other parts of the business, but if there's nowhere for them to go there, then ultimately they might have to be made redundant. If the business is restructured, one of those media stories I just had up before was talking around restructuring. So this is when a business just looks at how they structure themselves internally and how they look at the teams that they kind of have in place. Sometimes when they restructure, that does result in certain people not being needed anymore. So again, redundancy might follow. Technology, this is a big one. You know, over time, technology is replacing a lot of jobs, as simple as that. So this has been going on for years and years and years, but at some point, you know, a lot of jobs now have been replaced by technology, or at least partly. And if not completely, often there's a lot of jobs that at one point in a business needed a certain number of people to do, but now technology has reduced the number of people that are physically required to do that particular job or fulfill that particular role. So yeah, technology replacing people is a reason. Business relocating. So, you know, if you're, for whatever reason, you're relocating your business from Sydney to Melbourne, then unless the people want to move from Sydney to Melbourne with you, which you would give them the option of doing, you're going to be making the people in Sydney redundant and rehiring a new team in Melbourne. And if the business merges, this is another fairly big one. Often businesses merge, or a business buys out another business. That tends to lead to redundancies because you'll have then a lot of double ups. So you might have an accounting team in business A that merges with business B that also has an accounting team. You're probably not going to need all of those people to do the accounting for the newly formed merged business. So business mergers, business acquisitions also usually end up in some people being made redundant. Now, some things that you need to be aware of, okay? So if an employer decides to retrench employees, they've got to meet some basic standards as set out by law, okay? First off, the employer must notify the employee in writing the reasons for the retrenchment, the redundancy. They must notify the employee of the period of notice and the actual end date, and that should be one pay period at least. Often it would be more, but at least one pay period. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, they must provide the employee with a redundancy payment, which is at least as much as is set out in the National Employment Standards. So the Fair Work Commission, the government department, we talk about those a bit more as well, they have set up a whole... Look, you go to their website, there's a whole lot of information about managing people and the laws, the regulations around all of this. And part of this is a schedule of payments in terms of redundancy payments. So you can see the schedule here. Look, you wouldn't need to know this schedule, but know that it exists. And if an employer is making an employee redundant, they must provide a redundancy payment to each employee, which is at least equal to what you see here. So, for example, if the employee has been with you for 15 years, they are in the bottom category. They're at least 10 years. So they need to get a one-off payment when they are made redundant of at least 12 weeks. Okay. If they've been with you between 4 and 5 years, you can see there at least 8 weeks. Now, the reality is, and again, we talk about this later with transition, a lot of businesses now opt to provide payments which far exceed this to be socially responsible. At the end of the day, businesses don't want to be seen to be making redundancies. It's not a good look. So what businesses often do is they go above and beyond. Remember, that's what being socially responsible is all about, going above and beyond what the law says you have to do. So many businesses now will provide redundancy payments for retrenched employees that far exceed this. Look, it's good for the employee who is being made redundant, but it's also a good look to the public and the rest of the employees that are not being made redundant, because it demonstrates a level of social responsibility that, okay, whilst we're making this employee redundant, we are at least looking after them as best we can, kind of on the way out, if you like. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. Involuntary redundancy, so minimum notice period. So this is just an extension of that. You don't need to, like I said, you don't need to know the actual numbers. It would never ask you, if what's the minimum notice period you'd have to give to an employee. Really, I would stick with 1 pay period is probably the safest. But again, the point is it's all set out in law. As an employer, you need to be aware of your responsibilities and the things that you legally have to provide to your employees. Because if you don't do this stuff, you can end up in some trouble. Okay, now, there is an anomaly or something a little strange you need to be aware of with this one. Now, we say redundancy is involuntary because it is it's a decision that's being made by the employer, not the employee. The employee doesn't decide to be made redundant, but there are instances, and it's not uncommon, where an employee does choose to be made redundant, and it's called voluntary redundancy. So this completely flies in the face of everything we're saying here, that redundancy is an involuntary method of termination, because there is actually a version of voluntary redundancy as well. So demonstrate this by looking at some news items here. So Qantas with COVID, obviously their income pretty much went to zero. They had to make some decisions around staffing, and they had to make a lot of people redundant. Now, when businesses need to make some large-scale redundancies, what they usually do, is offer voluntary redundancy first. So in other words, say the business has to make 100 people redundant, rather than just going, okay, you're being made redundant, you're being made redundant, you're being made redundant, and choosing the people. What they'll often do is, look, we need to make redundancies. Does anyone want to put their hand up for voluntary redundancy? Question might be, well, why would someone want to be made redundant? You know what? Go back and look at the schedule of payouts. If you've got someone that's been there for many, many years, and minimum of 12 weeks pay, and bear in mind a lot of businesses will go far and above and beyond that, you might think, you know what, I will take a redundancy, I will take that payout, particularly if you're confident that you could find a job with another business fairly quickly. Then at the end of the day, that redundancy payout it's like money for old rope. That goes into the bank account. You might not even need to use it. Obviously, the idea behind a redundancy payment is to kind of tide you over until you find another job. But if you're quite confident you can find another job quite quickly, that redundancy payment straight in the bank, straight on a mortgage, straight into your super, whatever you want to do with it. And look, it's not unusual for these redundancy payments to extend into the many hundreds of thousands of dollars. Highly paid executives who've been at business for many, many years, we can be talking a huge amount of money here. You also might decide to take voluntary redundancy because you might actually have been planning to resign anyway, because for whatever reason you're not happy. And then all of a sudden they come up and go, who wants to be made redundant? And now instead of resigning, where you would get nothing, you are now taking voluntary redundancy and you're going to get this payout. Why not do that? So voluntary redundancy, and you can see in the thing here, crew members who took voluntary redundancies, again, recruitment opening up to crew who took VR, voluntary redundancy, resign. So you can see this language used in the media, and this is exactly what that's talking about. So there's more here. Amazon. So here's a story from Amazon. They had to cut 18,000 jobs, which was 6% of their workforce. Brutal cost-cutting move. And again, you can see at the bottom there circled now, it was through a combination of voluntary redundancies, and when it says terminations, that would have been forced redundancies. So look, it makes it much better for a business. If you need to make 100 redundancies and 80 people put their hand up and say, I'll take a voluntary, that means you only have to go through that quite uncomfortable process of actually forcing 20 redundancies. So just be aware of this one, this idea of voluntary redundancy. I don't think you'd be specifically asked about it, but be aware, and again, in a case study, if it mentions voluntary redundancies, now you will have an understanding of what that is all about. Involuntary method to dismissal. Look, actually on the right there, I've just put, because there are some colloquialisms, some kind of slang terms, being fired, given the sack, given a flick, given the boot. I think maybe at least a couple of those are kind of English. Maybe they're not ones used in Australia. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure being fired is used here, and given the sack, I reckon is. But yeah, this is the kind of language that people tend to use rather than saying I was dismissed or so-and-so was dismissed. They tend to use this kind of language. Now, two main reasons for this. Number one, unsatisfactory performance. That's the most common one. And actually, if you wanted to make that a little bit more accurate, I would probably say sustained or longer term unsatisfactory performance. So that's the main reason that people are ultimately dismissed. Second one, far less common, like really serious stuff, serious breaches of, misconduct, behavior, illegal behavior, theft, if someone steals from the business, sexual harassment of another member of staff, serious occupational health and safety breaches. So like these can be one-off things that happen that can lead to instant dismissal. Has to be quite serious for that to happen. But like I say, generally speaking, this happens because people are not performing, and ultimately that would lead to dismissal. I think I mentioned in a previous video that you can't just pull someone in as a manager and say, you're not performing, I'm firing you. You can't do that. Well, you can try to do that, but they might then sue you for unfair dismissal, which we'll look at in a minute. So you have to be careful with this one, and you have to follow a real process, okay, which you would document. So in the case of poor performance, if you were going to dismiss someone, you have to have conducted appropriate counselling and disciplinary procedures before you get to the stage of dismissal. In other words, you have to have given the employee reasonable opportunity to improve their performance, okay? As with retrenchment, notice must be given, again, based on length of service and all of that sort of stuff, or a pay period. But in the case of summary dismissal, instant dismissal, for serious misconduct, as we talked about in the previous screen, you actually don't need to give notice. You can just walk someone immediately from the premises. They're gone there and then. But this is what I was just talking about. Be aware of unfair dismissal, okay? Unfair dismissal can occur. This is where the Fair Work Commission gets involved. If an employee feels that they've been dismissed for harsh, unjust, or unreasonable reasons, or they have been dismissed without a proper procedure having been followed, that's what I was talking about before, the appropriate counselling and disciplinary procedures, then they can make an application to the Fair Work Commission for unfair dismissal. Happens all the time. At any one time, there's hundreds of these unfair dismissal cases going through Fair Work Commission. So if that happens, okay, so if an unfair dismissal claim is made by an employee who has been dismissed, first off, the Fair Work Commission tries to mediate the whole thing by helping both sides to resolve the issue through a mutual agreement. So they bring both sides together, you talk about it, and hopefully you would just resolve it mutually without things going any further. Step two, if that mediation does not work, then an arbitration hearing happens. And that's effectively like a court case where an arbitrator who acts like a judge will make a decision in favour of one party or the other about what's going to happen moving forward. Now, if that does happen and the Fair Work Commission, the arbitrator appointed by the Fair Work Commission, finds the dismissal to be unfair, they can order the business to either reinstate the employee or compensate them up for essentially half a year's pay. Okay. Now, 90%-ish of applications for unfair dismissal are dismissed on the grounds that the dismissal was not unfair, but that 10%, like I say, there's a lot of these cases going at any one time. It's actually a fair number that there are proven. So when you're working in business, when you're managing, when you're owning a business, you just need to be aware that if you're going to dismiss someone, you need to follow the correct procedure. If anything, go above and beyond what you think would be reasonable, so that if it goes to court, you've got a good case. Now, small businesses, slightly different rules, which you can find online in the Small Business Fair Dismissal Code. I'm not saying go and do that, but again, just be aware that small business don't have quite the same rules around this. It's a little bit looser for them because they don't have the resources. Okay, impacts of involuntary resignation. So on the negative side, again, loss of talent potentially is an issue for you. Again, breakdown of effective teams. Again, decline in morale. And now potentially increased pressure on remaining employees. We could throw in as another one here now. If you've kind of got a gap in the workforce, the work that that person was doing needs to be done. So that can actually increase the pressure on the other employees to kind of cover that person until someone is found to cover it properly. On the positive side, look, the culling potentially of non-productive employees. So if you are making forced redundancies, you probably want to look at people who were not performing great anyway. Look, the reduction in wage costs obviously is the big positive in terms of the business. But again, be careful with that one, because in the short term, you need to think about the impact of those redundancy payments. So in the short term, if you're paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars in redundancy payments, that payoff in terms of reduction in wage costs could be, quite a distance away. And changing the structure of the business, okay, it might allow you to restructure. If you're getting rid of a lot of people, it can actually potentially let you look at the structure that you have set up for your business, and it might allow you to make some changes to that structure that kind of make more sense moving forward, depending on, other aspects of the business, what's happening with your customer base and that sort of thing. So let's just quickly now go back and look at that study design descriptor, because we've kind of covered half of what you need to know. Now we've got to cover the rest of this termination management stuff, the entitlement considerations and the transition considerations. So far we've looked at those 4 types of termination. You understand what those are. You could write a bit about those. Now let's take entitlement considerations. Okay, so when the employment relationship ends, the employee is entitled to receive certain things. Okay, hence entitlement considerations. So the first thing they are entitled to is any remuneration still owing. So any pay owing, okay? Any accrued annual leave, that would be paid out as well. So that would be converted into dollars and you would receive that on top of any pay you're still owed. Any long service leave entitlements, again, would be converted and paid out to you. And then any severance payments. Now, again, here's new language. That's the same as redundancy payments. Severance pay is another way of, another terminology for redundancy pay or retrenchment pay, severance. So that would obviously apply only to retrenchments, not to the other forms of termination. But this is all stuff which the employee is entitled to receive. Legally, you have to provide, hence entitlement considerations. And I'm emphasizing this because history tells me that sometimes students do get a bit confused when they're writing in answers about entitlement considerations and transition, which we'll look at in a minute. So be absolutely clear. This is stuff that as a business you legally have to provide. And if you don't, then businesses can be fined up to $66,000 for each contravention, by the Fair Work Ombudsman, and that's as of 2021 figures. So that figure might change. And again, you don't need to know that $66,000 figure, but just know that there are extensive fines which can be, applied to businesses that do not meet the entitlement considerations of any terminated employees. That's the absolute key here. Okay, extensive fines apply. Now, transition considerations. Okay, so these ones only apply to retiring and retrenched employees. Okay, not the other two types of termination that we've looked at, just retiring and retrenched. Now, looking at it for retirees. So let's take it in turn. So the idea here is transition. This is where the social responsibility angle and looking after the employee and doing the right thing kind of comes into play. Okay. Now, retirees, okay, it sounds great maybe on the surface, I'm retiring, I don't have to work anymore. But actually retiring can be quite a stressful experience. Going from, having worked for the last 40 years of your life, 45 years of your life, maybe even more, to suddenly having no job to go to, that can be a real transition considerations for someone to make. A lot of people struggle with it. So retirees can often use some assistance with that transition to retirement. So for example, organising their finances, superannuation, pensions, investments, that sort of thing. So what you might do, what you might offer your retired or your retiring employees is access to some free financial advice based on all of this stuff, superannuation, pensions, investment, etc. So again, this is not something you legally have to do. It's not an entitlement consideration. It's a transition consideration because as a business, you don't have to do it. There's potentially a cost to you in providing it. If you're going to put them in touch with a financial advisor, those guys are not particularly cheap. So there's going to be a cost to you of doing it, but you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And you're demonstrating social responsibility by offering that service to the retiring employee. The change of lifestyle they're about to go through, that might be more counselling. So there's people out there that can they're counsellors that kind of help people transition from a working life to being retired. And again, there could well be a cost to the business of putting your retirees in touch with those people. But again, you do it because it's the right thing to do and you're demonstrating CSR. So that's the retiree side. Now, for retrenched employees or employees who you're making redundant, the way that you can demonstrate social responsibility and applying these transition considerations is one of the ways is by offering what we call outplacement services. Okay, now outplacement services is where you put them in touch with another business that provides these outplacement services, and the idea is the outplacement service provider helps the retrenched employees find a new job. Okay, so you'll be put in touch with an outplacement counsellor or consultant, and that person then would, meet with each retrenched employee, and they would counsel them around, being made retrenched, because that can be very, very stressful. They could help them with putting together a CV or a resume. They could provide some coaching around interview techniques and general career coaching, anything that is going to help that retrenched employee find new employment. That's the idea of outplacement services. Okay, very, very common thing that especially large businesses tend to do now. And again, it demonstrates social responsibility on the part of the business. Okay, so the cost of providing these outplacement services is borne by the employer. You're not asking the retrenched employee to pay for this. And look, the cost will vary depending on the level of service that you're going to provide, but I'd say in the range of $3,000 to $10,000 per person. It can be a lot more if you're offering much more extensive personalized services. So it depends on the service, but something along that. So you imagine if you're making several thousand people in redundant, which some businesses do, this is a big cost. So it can be really, really expensive to do it. But again, emphasize the business does this because it demonstrates their social responsibility. towards retrenched employees. It shows the remaining staff that the business does care about their people, even though we're having to make people redundant. We're doing it in the most comfortable, most ethical way. We're helping people as much as we can find a new job. And it's all this, social responsibility angle, which all businesses are so keen to show, not just inwardly to the remaining employees, but outwardly to the public as well. So this ultimately reduces the negative impact of the redundancies on morale, okay? Because the people that are left are presumably thinking, well, look, you might be scared that, you're next, or the next round of redundancies, it's your turn. But at least you'll know that if it does happen, the business is going to kind of look after you as best they can on your way out the door. So hopefully that kind of makes some sense. And that is it. So basically we covered the 4 types of termination that can happen. We covered those entitlement and transition issues. That's all you need to know. I will see you in the next video for Key Knowledge 8, I think participants in the workplace, I believe. Anyhow, I will see you then. Cheers for now.